Kate Milifalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book, and we are making our way through the scary, mysterious story of Mothman. This is video number 3. Mothman by John Keel. Strangest story. Now, keep in mind, written in 1975. Be sure to catch videos 1 and 2 from last week if you haven't already. It sets the story up. The story centers around a tragedy that occurs. And before this tragedy, there is this enormous flurry of weird manifestations in this small town in West Virginia. And John Keel goes to investigate it and realizes that, yes, there's a flurry, but there have been flurries in the past. And he's not convinced that UFOs are from some other planet. He thinks they're a natural part of the earth, somewhere here on the earth. And what's so interesting about this book is the time in which it was written. Was early days for the modern ufology craze. I guess I'll use the word craze. We have come a long way. I didn't realize until I reread this book, because I did read it originally when it first came out. They were still addressing people by Mr. and Mrs. and not just, hey, hi, John. Very formal. He does a lot of describing of women that I have just glossed right over, because women are described by their age, their size, their style of dress, very much a product of his time. He talks about flying saucers, which is not really the standard term used anymore. And he presents controversies around the apparition of UFOs that we've all kind of come to accept as standard, like, the government's involved, the military's involved. These are tropes or narratives that are very familiar to all of us now. At the time, this was shocking and controversial. He created the term Men in Black. It's a really interesting book. I'm enjoying revisiting it. I hope you're enjoying it too. Just keep in mind that this is an old book, and it's not at the forefront of what we know now today. But it's really interesting to see how people took these stories, how they took these experiences, what they thought. It's very interesting, because he spent a lot of time interviewing people in West Virginia on the ground. Point Pleasant is the name of this little town. So let's get to work here. We're on chapter 5, The Cold Who Came Down in the Rain. November 2nd, 1966, West Virginia. Man named Woodrow Derenberger, also we'll refer to him as Woody, his nickname. He's in his early 50s. He was a salesman for an appliance company. He had a wife and 2 children. And one night he was driving home in November in the rain and the country road in the woods. He heard a crash in the bed of his truck, but there was nothing there. There was a car behind him, and it suddenly cut in front of him and slowed down, kind of slowing him down. But then he realized, that's not a car. That's something shaped like an oil lamp chimney, and it's gray. The object blocked the road, and a door in it slid open, and a man got out. Now, Woody has been forced to come to a stop. Woody got out telepathic information from this man. He didn't talk, but he knew this guy was telling him, roll down your window. The guy was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had long dark hair that was combed back, and he had this kind of unusual, a little bit sinister big grin on his face, like somebody who didn't quite know what grins are for. His arms were crossed with his hands under his armpits, like this, which becomes a thing in this book. You'll hear about it more. He wore a dark top coat with shiny metallic green outfit underneath it. And in his head, Woody heard, "Do not be afraid. We mean you no harm." And then, "We come in peace." No, I made that up. Let's see here. "I come from a country much less powerful than yours." He asked Woody's name. Woody told him. Now, it doesn't say if he thought it or said it. The guy said, "My name is Cold," like not hot, cold. "I sleep, breathe, and bleed, even as you do." He nodded toward the lights of Parkersburg in the distance and asked, "What kind of a place is that?" And Woody tried to explain. It was a center for business and homes, a city. In his world, Cold explained, such places were called gatherings. So they have this telepathic conversation, and he gets back into the chimney, and it goes up, and it hovers over the road, and other cars go back and forth and don't even seem to notice it. Cold told Woody, report this, and I'll return later to confirm that people know about this conversation that we've had. See you later. Woody went home. He was freaked out. He went home and he told his wife, and she convinced him, "You better call the police." And their response was, "Do you need a doctor?" So the next day they came over, or he went to the police department, I don't remember, and there was lengthy questioning. And this story ended up in all the local media. There were, a couple of small newspapers and a TV channel, nothing exciting. Other drivers the same night and the same place say what they saw was a man speaking to a driver in a panel truck stopped on the side of the road. That would have been Woody in his truck. One woman stopped to watch an object that was soaring low over the highway after the time where Woody had had this experience. Another young man, he was scared because this object hovered over his car. It shone a blindingly bright light on him. Woody became a local celebrity. Crowds came to his farm every night to see UFOs. Interesting, that they assumed that they would be in his farm. He wasn't at home when this happened. His phone began to ring 24/7. Lots of crank calls, lots of hang-ups, lots of threats, but he got weird threats telling him to shut up and not talk about this. Then Mr. Cold came back. Now, in the book, we're jumping to a little bit of a different story, to be continued. Keel says that Native Americans avoided West Virginia. Now, I looked this up because that sounded not correct historically to me. And so there's a way in which you can look at that as true, but it's not as he's implying, which they were afraid and they stayed away. That's not exactly what happened. In the 1600s, early 1600s, the indigenous tribes of the area got pushed out by the Iroquois Federation. So this was a territorial thing. That's why they left. And the Iroquois used West Virginia as a hunting area. They didn't settle in there. So it's true nobody was living there, but there are reasons for that. And there were no permanent settlements there until later in the 1700s. White people eventually pushed out all of the Native Americans, and there were no federally recognized tribal lands in West Virginia. But that doesn't mean that there weren't any Aboriginal people. And today, well, in 1975, in West Virginia, there were over 11,000 residents who claimed direct indigenous ancestry to a given tribe. So I have done a bit of checking on a lot of things that he says in this book. Not people's reports of what they saw, but when he makes blanket statements like that, I've been checking, because I found more often than not there were preconceived notions that were incorrect, or there were discoveries made since he wrote that book originally that undid some old beliefs. Researchers in the 1960s and 70s thought that West Virginia was an uncomfortable vacuum. They said there were strange ancient ruins there, circular stone monuments. So there had to be early settlers. But the book said that the Native Americans didn't build such monuments, but that's not true. I looked it up. Yes, they did. Now, I think what's going on here is that, archaeology continues and things are misunderstood, reinterpreted in light of new evidence. And I think that's what we have going on here. So the book mentions that there was a curse on the area, but I could see why, if you had an uninhabited, huge area of land and you didn't want people getting in on your hunting, there may be rumors of a curse. They said the Shawnee put this curse on the area in 1760. Let's see what we can learn about that. The Cherokees have a tradition that when they went into Tennessee, they found the region inhabited by a weird race of white people who lived in houses and were apparently quite civilized. But they had one problem. Their eyes were large and sensitive to the light. Now, this would be before white people were actually there. And when he says Tennessee, that it's next to West Virginia. So these people could only see at night, and the natives chased these white moon-eyed people, is what they called them, chased them away. And the question is, did they move to West Virginia? There are still oddball rumors of albino people in the back hills of Kentucky and Tennessee. But he says, to be fair, there are also myths and rumors of mysterious people living in New Jersey, 40 miles from Manhattan. So we'll just take it with a grain of salt. The day before Woody first met Mr. Cole, the National Guardsman at Point Pleasant Armory saw a huge bird. And when he returned with friends to see it, the huge bird was gone. And this wasn't just like, a big crow or a vulture or something. This was scary. November 4th of 1966, Woody was riding with a coworker, and he suddenly got a tingling in his forehead. And then Mr. Cole, in his mind, started talking to him telepathically. Cole said that he was from a planet Lanulos, which was in the galaxy of Ganymede. Like Earth, flora, fauna, seasons, all that. Mr. Cole was married to a woman named Kimmy and had 2 sons. People there had lived to be as long as 175 Earth years. No war, no poverty, no hunger, no misery. He told Woody to brace himself because it would hurt when they disconnected telepathically. And that he had a sharp pain in his head. So 2 weeks later, 2 weird salesmen. So it's not clear what they were selling. Bibles, hardware, Mormon missionaries. They were unsure what they were selling. It's not that we don't remember. They couldn't say exactly. They said they were from Salem, Oregon, and they went door to door asking about Woody and his alleged contact. door to door to all of his neighbors and friends in town. Okay, there's a guy called Gray Barker who was a pioneer ufologist who began in 1952 investigating something called the Flatwoods Monster. At the home of a guy called Newell Partridge in Salem, West Virginia, he was talking about a missing dog and weird TV reception. And on November 14th of 1966, his German Shepherd had run out into the night, disappeared off the face of the earth. His TV went blank at the same time. The dog went nuts, running out. He said, on my television, a fine herringbone pattern appeared and a loud whining noise, winding up to a high pitch, crescendo, decrescendo, up and down on a musical scale. And it sounded like a generator winding up. It reminded me of a hand-field generator that one might use for portable radio transmission in an emergency. So this dog who had run outside began wailing and went towards their hay barn. The man used a flashlight and picked up two red eyes that were like bike reflectors. Much larger, though, than usual eyeballs, and much larger than any of the local wild animals' eyeshine would have been. The dog was snarling and went after the eyes, and Newell said he felt an odd cold chill and fear, and the dog did not come back. He said he slept with a loaded, what. Next morning, he checked around, and near the barn, he found many dog prints where the eyes had been. And then he saw an area where it looked like the dog had been chasing its tail in a circle, and then nothing. No more prints. No indication of where the dog might have gone. He said he had a very eerie feeling. For what it's worth, who knows. So chapter 6, now we're getting down to it. Mothman. During World War II, there was an area here of high explosive production in Point Pleasant, just outside of town. They ripped up an animal sanctuary. They made miles of underground tunnels. They had 100 steel igloos to store explosives. These were domed buildings with roofs covered in dirt and grass to camouflage them. They were not visible from the air. There were very few roads at all in the area, and it was all unpaved. Any road that did exist was a dirt road, and this looked like a bird haven. Interesting, like a bird haven. After the war, the explosives were removed from the buildings. The tunnels underground were plugged up with concrete, the entrance exits. The igloos were sold, or they stood empty. They got rid of some of them remained. They now stand out, 1975, stand out starkly, and there are other random infrastructures that once had been camouflaged and hidden, but now were stark ruins. This was a place for teenage drag strip racing and Lover's Lane. It was cruised every night by cops, but there wasn't a high level of enthusiasm about it. There had been an archery range and a picnic area. All this place was the infrastructure to maintain a staff, office buildings and stuff. They weren't crumbling to the ground, but they were deteriorating, locked up, boarded up, deteriorating. November 15th of 1966, two young couples were driving around looking for friends, they said, and the area around there was deserted. They were near the old boarded up building of a generator plant when they saw two bright red circles, and they screeched to a halt, and those two bright red lights moved, and they saw that they were the eyes of a huge animal. It was a 7-foot tall gray thing shaped like a man, two legs, but it had big wings folded on its back. Yikes. Its eyes were hypnotic. It shuffle walked into the door of this generator building that was boarded up. They drove off fast. They saw another one, or maybe it was the same one, they don't know, standing on a hill. As they rushed by it, it rose into the air and it followed them at 100 miles per hour without even flapping its wings. It just went by. And it squeaked like a mouse. It followed them to the city limits. Earlier, they had seen a dead dog by the side of the road. And now when they go by, they find that this dog is gone. They thought that was interesting. They panicked and they went right to the sheriff's office, kept going till they got there. He later said that they looked so scared that he took them seriously. They were completely freaked out. They led him back to the site of where they found this thing. He was baffled to find that all of a sudden his police car radio was emitting very loud signals over the voice of the dispatcher. Never happened before. They found nothing, and then the next morning he held a press conference with witnesses, with these kids. And reporters got to interview them. My how times have changed, right? Mary Heyer, who wrote for the paper The Messenger, she sent the story out over the AP wire, and someone began calling it Mothman. Just for the sake of brevity, in the book, and I adopted the same habit, in referring to this area where explosives were stored and the underground tunnels and the old buildings and the generator and the Mothman, in the book he calls it the TNT area, and that's what I call it too. So driving through the TNT area, exactly 3 years since it was now exactly 3 years since John Flaxton saw a similar creature in Kent, England. So they didn't know about this, but there was this report 3 years previously. Now there were all these cars, long lines of cars coming to see, because this went out on the AP wire. Armed men showed up, and they were going to figure this out, and approach the building. As Keel observes, there's not much to do in Point Pleasant. There's 6,000 people in 22 churches and no bars, so everybody showed up in this area to investigate the Mothman. That night, a man with 2 friends who were women, they saw a flashing red light on some object in the sky over the area. So there's a couple called the Bennetts who were leaving a friend's house. They saw a big gray thing with glowing red eyes that rose up from the ground behind their parked car. The women were so freaked out. One of them so freaked out she dropped her baby, didn't get hurt. So she was paralyzed with fear and watched this thing unfold its wings. Her husband grabbed her and baby, and they ran back inside their friend's house that they had just left, and they locked themselves in. But they saw this is creepy, they saw the red eyes peering at them from the porch, peering in the window. They called the police, the cops arrived, but by then the creature had gone. Meanwhile, back with Woody, he was beset with UFO hunters on his land and on the phone. Some showed up armed. They would hide behind trees, and they said they were hoping to bag a spaceman. In the middle of all of this chaos, Mr. Cold, and he said his first name was Indrid, he drove up in a black VW. He was dressed all in black with black suit, and he talked with Woody, and then he left. Woody said that Mr. Cold had given him a vial of medicine that immediately cured a stomach problem he'd had for a long time. Random weirdness, I don't know. Directly across the river from the TNT area, a Mrs. Roy Gross, I think that's what that is, she woke at 4 4:45 in the morning with her small dog going crazy. She looked outside and saw a huge object hovering over a tree in the next field, something with bright red and green lights, something circular the size of a house that zigzagged and disappeared. She saw a giant bird with bright red eyes. A giant bird with bright red eyes were seen in several places by different people around the same time. It was sighted in a number of different counties. People drove hundreds of miles to the TNT area to do the night watch. The few who did see this bird were totally freaked out. It evoked terror in people. It chased cars, and it seemed particularly to go after women. 5 teenagers on a country road saw it in their headlights, and they said, we didn't report it. Keel found them eventually. We didn't report it because nobody would believe us because we're teenagers. One man went out to see why the dog was barking. He saw a 7-foot gray creature with flaming eyes. He was frozen, and then he realized he had lost time. That thing flew off. He staggered in home late, and his wife thought that he was having a heart attack. He looked so upset, so bad. So this wingless flying object was seen all over the county. Now, when they say wingless, it doesn't mean it didn't have wings. It meant it was flying without its wings, folded up on its back. So this happened beginning around the beginning of November, so from about Halloween to December. At 7:45 p.m., a family of 7 were driving in New Jersey when they saw a red, green, and white object. It fell out of the sky and disappeared right in front of them. They thought there'd been an airplane crash. And then they saw a large glowing sphere over the treetops, and they thought the crash had caused a fire and that the plane and the trees were on fire. They stopped and they got out to watch, but then the sphere moved and they realized it wasn't a fire. It was a UFO, and it had been hovering, and it came towards them and it went over their heads. It was silent. It turned on 3 powerful lights, and it kept going, and it disappeared to the north. Some of the family were hysterical, and they drove home. One guy in the family didn't believe in UFOs. One woman called the local Air Force base and talked to an officer, and he was very interested. An hour later, they got a long-distance call. Now, this doesn't sound like much today, but in those days, a long-distance call was unusual, expensive, and it required negotiating person to person with an operator. But they got a long-distance call from another Air Force base, and they were all interviewed by 3 or 4 officers in the military. Conversations were taped, and while they were talking, she could tell that the Air Force was filling out a report form. And the Air Force didn't answer any of their questions, but they had to answer a lot of questions. It seems that the local Air Force base then called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and Project Blue Book officers then called the family. I wrote here, such sexist descriptions of women. Yikes, I can't deal with it. Anyway, there were several reports from different areas of people that were plagued at night by unfamiliar beeping, like radio signals. Some were so freaked out by all of it that they moved. Meanwhile, thousands were visiting this TNT area with TV crews and newspaper people, interviewing everybody, interviewing each other. Mothman instead popped up in different places, appealing to the most skeptical. One guy described the creature chasing him with a wingspan of 10 feet. The guy was so traumatized that he couldn't go to work. He described a very weird fear that was induced by the sight of this thing, and a sense that this thing just wasn't right. A hunter in Pennsylvania reported a 7-foot-tall bird like an ostrich zigzagging through the trees. Ostriches don't fly. You know, I wrote all this down. I didn't even think about that. I'm just taking notes and taking notes. I don't think ostriches fly. They're flightless. His dog chased it, but when he caught up with it, when the dog caught up with the bird, he let out a howl and ran back to the man, whimpering with his tail between his legs, and the dog was freaked out. A family 70 miles away watched a whole flock of these birds for 2 hours. When they got up the courage to approach the birds just completely flew away. Their description of the birds could not be identified by experts. They were about 5 feet tall. They had a 10-foot wingspan. They had reddish heads. They had dark brown backs and gray breasts, and they had 6-inch straight beaks. They didn't match the descriptions of any of the other sightings of the weird winged things. Between 66 and 67, more than 100 adults saw the Mothman. Interesting fact, nobody could see its face. It's like a blur. They couldn't see its face. In historical descriptions of angels and demons, the faces are often covered or non-existent. Not saying that angels and demons are the Mothman or that the Mothman is an angel or a demon. We're just saying, is this the same type of entity? One woman in West Virginia saw its face when she encountered one on her lawn one night. She said it had a funny face. It didn't have a face like a bird. It had no beak and it had red eyes. In fact, a creature that size would need far bigger wings to be able to fly just by air. Well, that's the least of its problems, but still. And birds don't just ascend like a helicopter. They run and flap their wings and get up the momentum. So this thing just lifted up like a copter. Keel heard about all of this from his friend Gray Barker and thought at first that Gray was teasing him. And when Gray convinced him, no, this is for sure going on. Look at the paper from the area. Look at the AP reports. This is going on. So Keel decided to head for Point Pleasant. Chapter 7, The Night of the Bleeding Ear. So there's a UFO researcher at the time who was very active in New York by the name of Jen Stevens. Her phone started getting weird calls one night. Her 15-year-old daughter was at home with her boyfriend, and they were interrupted by this strange whining on the phone. They called in a telephone repair person who said, well, that description, your phone could be tapped. Several days later, her husband was at a snack bar having coffee when a tall, tan man, and they mentioned the complexion of these men in black all the time because they're noticeable and significantly different. And he has the worst time trying to explain what they look like. Tall, tan man that he did not know sat down next to her husband. Started a conversation. He says to the husband, there've been a lot of people watching the sky every night down by the river. And the husband, Peter, who had been one of those people down by the river, said, I beg your pardon. And the guy starts talking about UFOs, and Peter's trying to get info out of him. And he was starting to feel uncomfortable because the guy was dodging all of his questions. Finally, the man excused himself, got up to leave, and says to him very pointedly, people who look for UFOs should be very, very careful. So Keel asked her to have her husband Peter draw the guy. So he made a couple of different drawings, one for himself, one for Keel. And several weeks later, his home got broken into and ransacked, and the only thing stolen was the picture that he sketched for himself. But even more strangely, 2 months later, Peter, who was healthy and in his 30s, died suddenly. Doesn't say why. Jen told Keel only this one thing, and she would not elaborate. She seemed afraid to elaborate. She told him that her husband's death was related to this UFO business. Keel had received a copy of the sketch. Peter had mailed one. It didn't get stolen because it had been mailed already. And it was described by many witnesses looking like a brother to their particular Men in Black encounters. So these guys all kind of look the same. Keel did a taped study of the phone calls with no one on the other end, just breathing. And he said that they were not like, do you remember breather phone calls before? I don't know if people still do this, but before cell phones, it was not uncommon for women to get these weird phone calls where somebody whose voice they didn't recognize would be on the other end and would just do a lot of heavy breathing, implying or actually doing untoward things. And he thought, okay, well, is that what's going on here? And he said that the breathing was evenly spaced, a series of pulses resembling the swishing sound of a phonograph when the needle reaches the end of the record and does not reject. Heavy breathing is not as uniform. So Woody agreed to hours. He agreed to go to hours of psychiatric and medical testing. He said, okay, I'm not making this up, and I think I'm perfectly sane. And he allowed himself to go through all this testing. And the results were, he's normal. He had no abnormalities. Now we're talking neurological, physiological, behavioral, emotional, psychological. No abnormalities, no pathology, no mental disorder, nothing physically wrong with him. December 4th of 66, this little town called Gallipoli in Ohio, 4 pilots were together when they saw a large winged creature going 70 miles per hour. They thought at first it was a very reckless airplane, but as it got closer, they saw it was a giant bird with a long neck. And they all said it looked like something prehistoric, like a pterodactyl. One tried to fly up and take pictures. They were at the airport, these 4 pilots together, a small airport. One of them tried to get on a little private plane and fly up and take pictures, but it had vanished by the time he got up there. 3 days later, Keel arrived at Point Pleasant for the first time. Now, we've had him in earlier videos having conversations with people in Point Pleasant. The book is not chronological. It jumps around. He met with Deputy Halstead. He believes that the deputy tells him he believes that the witnesses were legitimately fearful, really scared. Keel cold called the McDaniels. They were the ones who saw, I can't even remember what they saw. They saw something related to all of this. Mrs. McDaniels, as he calls her, welcomed him in, and she started to phone all her friends and neighbors who'd been witnesses, and the house filled up. And so this is when he first met Connie, her daughter. I guess she was the one who was driving in the car, and they saw this thing and it shone a light. Connie's eyes were the sore ones with the really sore eyes. And Keel said when he met her, her eyes were still red and irritated. He said he was struck by how genuinely scared all the people were who had witnessed this stuff. Mary Heyer, the newspaper reporter, she confirmed that she'd heard them retell their story many times, and they were always consistent. They weren't embroidering it. They weren't changing it. They all described not being able to see a face or something science fiction-like that they couldn't describe, but they all said the eyes were hypnotic and distracting. They didn't smell anything. There were no footprints. Keel and Connie and Keith, I think that's her boyfriend, and Mary, they went to the TNT site, and the crowds had finally gotten bored and strangers had gone away. So the four of them toured the place and found nothing until Connie saw two red eyes by a wall. Nobody else saw. Mary, who had been outside, they'd split up, she claimed that she saw a tall figure running away. Also, she heard a weird metallic sound. Connie was hysterical. She was crying, freaking out. Somebody with them, I don't know which one, suddenly had blood coming out of their ear, and they all observed the air felt oppressive. So the group was now pretty much in panic mode. Keel knew that blood coming out of your ear could be a sign of a concussion and evidence that the air pressure had changed. But they saw nothing in the sky. Keel went alone later and drove the area back and forth the same night. Which, you know, in my opinion, I gotta say, is pretty brave of him. I'm not sure I'd be eager to do that. He said, Mothman did not pop out of the bushes and say boo, but I did have one curious experience. As I passed a certain point on one of the isolated roads, I was suddenly engulfed in fear. I stepped on the gas, and after I went a few yards, my fear vanished as quickly as it came. So he did it again, and he went back and forth a couple of times, and he said it was really hard because the fear was just absolutely overwhelming. But it was like a zone, and he said he could feel it tingling on the back of his neck too. So he decided it must be some sort of energy beam in that area. Next day, he went back and tried it again, and he said the zone of fear was gone. Keel was convinced there was some type of UFO phenomenon. He was then introduced to UFO witnesses, people who saw metallic saucers flying around in the middle of the night over this area. Even neighbors, it happened so often that neighbors would call their next door neighbor or the friend down the street. They're here again, go outside and look, and they'd all talk. He found dozens of people who were eyewitnesses. The doctor who did the tests on Woody later had telepathic communication from something claiming to be a UFO. Now that's creepy. Woody and his family were invited to Cape Kennedy for a week. They did tours in the daytime, but every evening he had hours of questioning. That's weird too. According to Woody, his interrogators showed him a star map and pointed to a speck on it, telling him that's where they're from. They said this is NASA, military, who knows? They said they had interviewed several other contactees, all with stories similar to his own. When he asked why they didn't release their UFO information to the public, they allegedly replied that it would cause panic. Women would toss infants, and this kind of panic would sweep the world. Oh, women, they'd be so emotional. He brought home a flock of souvenirs as proof of his trip, photographs, even a scrap of the material used in astronauts' spacesuits. And he said, this is the same kind of material worn by Mr. Cold under his coat on that rainy November evening. Yes, chapter 8, Procession of the Damned. So once Mothman and Indrid Cold made themselves known in West Virginia, a wave of weirdness began. Sightings of caped men struggling through snow at the side of rural roads and vanishing when someone pulled over and offered them a ride. Weird census takers in old-fashioned black limousines that looked brand new. They came to random holes, asking specifically the number of children in the house and their ages. or they asked for a glass of water randomly. And these stories are very similar, interestingly enough, to medieval fairy tales. These sorts of things happen then. Not the car, but these kinds of things. A blonde, well-dressed woman with a Southern accent began dropping in on strangers in Ohio and West Virginia. She introduced herself as Mr. John Keel's secretary and then proceeded to fill in a form with tons of personal information. This is not typical, questions not typical of UFO investigators. Things like your health, your income, the number of cars you own, those were the questions they asked. By the way, Keel had no secretary. One of the witnesses of the Mothman was followed by a large man in a wig in a strange car late at night. She evaded him blocking the road and got away. This is very unusual for a remote area that something like this would happen. If this was an attempted crime, very unusual. Mary Hyre began getting many peculiar visitors beginning in January of 67. For example, a guy came into the office. It was 20 degrees outside. He was in short sleeves shirt, a light shirt, lightweight pants. He had dark, deep-set eyes with odd, thick glasses, long black hair in a bowl cut, and shoes that seemed to be lifts. Now, this is a time when men all had, like my haircut. His shoes seemed to have weird lifts. He was only 4 feet 6 inches tall. He had an odd accent. He asked for directions to the other town. She said his eyes were hypnotic, and he kept getting closer and closer to her. He claimed that his truck broke down in Detroit, and he'd hitchhiked to this place in West Virginia. He made her so uncomfortable that she quickly got up and got the circulation manager, who had been in the back room. I didn't know that. Made him join her. And the two of them talked to the guy, and they said it was weird because he knew more about West Virginia than they did. She was distracted by a phone call. While she was on the phone, he picked up a pen and examined it like he'd never seen a pen before. She told him to keep it. He gave a really weird laugh and ran away with it like he'd gotten away with something. Just so strange. January 9th of 1967, the Christensen family, who had previous UFO non-encounter that we discussed in our earlier video, they'd moved to New Jersey. They had enough of this stuff, and they drove their car on this occasion from Florida, where they'd been to Florida. They had a new house in New Jersey with a new phone number. Nothing was listed. Nobody knew where they were. 5:30, they got home, and there's a knock on the front door. A weird, tall guy was there. Their daughter, Connie, said that he was the strangest man that she'd ever seen in her life. He asked, "Does Ed Christensen live here? I'm from the Missing Heir Bureau." Heir as in inheriting, H-E-I-R. "Mr. Christensen may have inherited a great deal of money. May I come in?" She let him in, and I wrote, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Oh my God. So the guy was about 6.5 feet tall, so sure, come on in. And he weighed about 300 pounds. He was very broad, not fat, but just like giganto. He had a Russian-style fur hat and with a black visor, a long black coat, but it was too lightweight for the weather. It was probably like a lightweight trench coat, and it was really cold outside. He said he'd only take 40 minutes. He took off his hat, and he had a huge, gigantic, round head, a pointed face with a small chin, and dark hair that looked recently shaved. He had huge pop eyes that were far apart, and they didn't work together. And I wrote in the margin, "This guy's cute." Is he married? Ed saw, said, he saw the guy, and he said, "There's a mistake. I don't know anybody who would die and leave me money. And the guy said, oh, it's no mistake. I just need you to verify a few questions. I can't believe this. He took off his coat and removed a gold badge that was in his shirt pocket. And he didn't do it fast enough. And Ed thought he saw a K and a small X and some writing. But it was really obvious the big guy didn't want them to see it. So under his long coat, he only had on a lightweight short-sleeved shirt and pants that were a little too short. They came up to his calves when he sat down, and he had unusually thick soles. He had long, thin green wire attached to his leg, up from his sock, came out of his sock and up his pants leg, and it seemed pushed into the skin of his leg, which had a very large brown spot in it. I don't know what's going on here. He was extremely pale. They all thought he looked sick. He was so pale. He looked like Mary's visitor in a way, that weird guy with the pen. He had a weird, tinny voice and kind of monotonous, kind of a monotone like a computer. He introduced himself, but later the family couldn't agree on what name he said. And that's interesting. Was it Mr. Brown? Was it Mr. Smith? He said, my friends call me Tiny. He spoke to the dog and the dog calmed down. They invited him to stay for dinner. And he said, well, I'm on a diet. I would like a glass of water, though. He was having trouble breathing. He was wheezing. And he said that he believed that Ed had inherited a large amount of money, but he needed information. And he took out a pen and a pad of paper and started asking weird questions. Did Ed have any scars or birthmarks? Ed said he had a scar on his back from an operation. He had an appendix scar. And, okay, this guy wanted length, width, exact position. He wanted all the schools that Ted had ever attended, number and type of automobiles in the house. He asked, would they be willing to fly any place in the U.S. to collect the inheritance? They would have to be present when the will was read. And they agreed that sure, we'll go on that trip. His face got redder and redder and wheezier and wheezier. And finally he asked for the water. And he took a large yellow pill out of his pocket, downed it. It seemed to get better. He asked Ed about 3 names, and Ed didn't recognize any of them. Only he remembered the name Roy Stevens. Remember Jen Stevens, the investigator with the weird phone calls? Keel later got the same story from other family members separately. He interviewed all 5 of them separately, and they all had the same story. Keel called this a Man in Black report. When he left, he said that Ed would be notified. When the weird guy left, he said that Ed would be notified by mail in 10 days. He walked out to the road and he made a signal of some sort down the street, and a 1963 black Cadillac drove out of the trees with no headlights on, drove away. Picked him up, drove away. Next morning, Ed got a phone call, and a woman said, oh, we've located the Ed Christensen, the heir, in California. Click. Keel had no explanation for the green wire. He thinks the K on the badge was really the Greek letter sigma. It's often seen in UFO cases. And in science, the letter sigma symbolizes the strange or the unknown. 2 days later, Mrs. McDaniel saw a Mothman while she was walking to a restaurant, and she described the typical Mothman. And I thought this was really funny. I thought I'd mention this. So she describes him as floating. She describes it to him as he was hovering and floating. Keel says it sounded to him like she was talking to somebody using a hang glider, but hang gliders were so rare that people wouldn't even maybe have the terminology. There's a footnote in the book where he explains what a hang glider is. They were not known in the population in general in 1967. Christensen's friends came home from Europe. These are the Martinos, and they stayed overnight with the Christensens. Gwen and Connie were woken at 3 o'clock in the morning by increasingly loud hammer on metal sounds overhead. Gwen got up to check and it stopped. She went back to bed, started. She got up again, it stopped. Every time she got up, it stopped. And finally, it did fade away. 2 nights later, the Christensen parents came home and their kids were really freaked out, very upset. They had heard this hammering and heard footsteps outside in the snow. Connie's 19-year-old boyfriend looked outside and saw a tall figure in a long white cape hurrying away from the house. It leaped over a 5-foot fence and disappeared. Next morning, Ed found a large human set of foot tracks that went to a building on the other side of the fence and then into the wall of the building. There were no other prints. Where did the figure go? So, a UFO witness, let me see here what I've got going on. Okay, I'm going to stop here because there's a lot left of this chapter. So this is the end of video number 3, and we'll proceed with video number 4 here in a second. And we're waiting to hear from this UFO witness. So, much more interesting book than I remembered. All I could remember was a big weird thing. Very interesting. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed. There's all kinds of tomfoolery going on, and people are being unsubscribed, and people are not being put forward. We're all losing views and subscribers. I'm not sure what the issue is. I have heard that if you don't make enough money for them, it's sort of a feedback loop that they put you forward less and less, then you make less, and believe me, if I had to use the money that I make on YouTube for anything other than buying a couple of books, I would be in deep trouble. I do feel sorry for people that are trying to support themselves doing this. It's stressful. Things are really stressful here right now. I don't want to go into it, but really stressful. So I appreciate your support. I'm very grateful for anybody who listens to these books. Not the most popular thing on YouTube. But if you have questions or suggestions, I'm open to it. And in the meantime, thank you. And Slongafoil. Sláinte.